hearts of men. The shadow knows.
Tune up! Level up your fun. Tune up! Your quest has now begun. Tune up. We'll show you how it's done. Tune up! Tune up! Tune up! Tune up!
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Tabletop Tune Up. I'm your host, Mark. I'm joined here by my buddy Ben. How you doing, Ben?
I'm good. How you guys doing out there in Radio Land?
They can't answer, Ben.
Okay.
They're out there and we're here.
Well, I'm doing well. How you doing, Mark?
Not too bad. Hey, that music just made me think of like a classic 1930s, 1940s club where kind of Pulp has begun. You know, Pulp had its heyday. And we're going to be talking about Pulp today.
Yeah. As you can guess, Mark, it's one of my favorite genres to play in. I think it's a great kind of setting for a RPG.
And that's exactly why I'm going to pick your brain a little bit, because I honestly haven't played a whole lot of Pulp. I think I played we played a pickup game, didn't we, back at Gen Con a few years ago?
We did.
That might have been my first, that was my first legit, like this is a Pulp game.
Yeah. Here's what I'm going to say, though. I think that you're underrating the pulpiness of other games you have played.
I would agree. Back in the day, we played, what was that, Palladium games? Beyond the Supernatural.
There we go. Yep.
And we definitely played that very pulpy.
Yeah, that could have just as easily come out of the pages of Weird Tales or Tales from the Crypt or any of those other Splat magazines from way back when.
So I guess I've played it, but at the time I didn't recognize its classification. But we're gonna talk about Pulp RPGs and what makes them special, and we're gonna talk about the genre. And Ben, you're gonna be our expert on this.
Okay. Excellent.
Well, you're kind of the aficionado on this, dude. You've been running these games
I love Pulp.
Yeah, you've been running these games for a bit. Not for me, but
we'll fix that.
Well, let's start with the beginning. Why would we want to play Pulp? What makes this genre like interesting or unique? Why should people give a crap?
Well, first of all, I think it's a really great natural genre for RPG players to get into. And I think, as I was hinting at a moment ago, the bones of Pulp are in all of our favorite stuff. So just to give you an example, like Star Wars, that's basically what George Lucas made when he couldn't get Flash Gordon. And Flash Gordon is sci-fi pulp from the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, it really kind of hits all those pulpy kind of things, doesn't it?
Yeah. So when you think about what pulp is, though, I don't want to get it confused with period science fiction or period stuff in a certain sense, right? Normally what happens is you say, hey, you want to play a pulp game? Everybody goes, oh, we're going to be in the 1930s. Often, yeah, that's where a lot of those initial pulp magazines really get popular. But think about it differently. If you think about the kind of game that you're going to play, it's going to be one with high action. It's going to be one with dastardly villains. It's going to be one with amazing locations and nonstop action, right? And those are the kinds of things that make for a great game.
And that action isn't just, there's something about Pulp serials that the action is very dynamic. I was thinking of the, what was that? What was that film? The Pirates of the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was this one where he's like fighting on this rolling thing that's going down a hill.
That's right. Like the inside of a water wheel or something.
Yeah. It's so goofy. It's so off the charts, but it's like, oh, this is just straight out of a Pulp magazine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like one of my very, very favorite ever sequences in any movie is the truck chasing Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, yeah.
The Ark is on this truck and our hero,
right.
He's got to chase this truck. He starts on a horse and then he jumps onto the side of the truck and he climbs over it and he does all these things. He's got to fight all the Nazis off it. And then one of these guys actually shoots him in the arm and then tosses him out the front of the truck. And he does one of these classic Western stagecoach, gets dragged along under, has to climb back up over the truck.
It's so amazing.
I mean, by the time you're done with the sequence, you're exhausted. It's incredible.
Yeah. Spielberg is God, he's just underrated. If you can believe anybody could say he's underrated, he's just
Yeah.
amazing. But let's talk about that real quick. I want to touch on Raiders because, like, the golden era of Pulp, you had like Tarzan, Flash Gordon, and the Shadow, and that DNA kind of continued throughout the time, and then it kind of got into Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Mummy, The Rocketeer.
And Star Wars, as we said, yeah.
Yeah, but you're going to notice a lot of these films are pretty old.
Uh-huh.
Like, is Pulp just kind of like, is it in decline or is it just hidden in plain view?
It's a great question. I think, I want to say it's hidden in plain view. Some more recent things that would be an example of Pulp, it would be like Jumanji. That made a lot of money. People like seeing that movie.
Oh, yeah.
I think you could also probably think about, frankly, any of the more recent Star Wars stuff. That is not science fiction, properly speaking, in the kind of mid-century old school sense. There's not really a lot of science to it. It's a kind of a futuristic fantasy, and those Pulp roots are in that.
Yeah, I guess you could see that. I mean, the Star Wars, the original ones definitely felt pulpy. Maybe it's the lower budget nature of them that made it feel a little bit more pulp. And the newer ones, maybe they're so glossy and expensive that it's like maybe it loses some of that shine. But I was also thinking of I mentioned that Fury Road.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
It felt kind of pulpy. Like the villains in there were kind of overcranked. They're kind of goofy. They got their side henchmen. There's kind of like, it's one thing you see in a lot of these pulp shows like Dick Tracy. It's not just Dick Tracy. He's got this pantheon of like ridiculous villains. Hammerhead.
Yeah.
Whatever.
It's certainly true that the pulp genre was intended to excite readers immediately. It's almost hyperbole, all the stuff that goes on in a pulp thing. As we were talking about the action a moment ago with the truck chase and the water wheel sword fight. Like the same is true of the villains. The villains are not at all subtle. These are not people who are bureaucrats pushing pencils and stuff. These are mad scientists. These are guys who are bent on taking over the world.
Yeah.
Interestingly, too, I think you make a mistake if you make them really scary, realistic serial killers. This is not like an episode of Dexter, or it's not
fun.
Sounds of the Lambs. Yeah, like it should feel fun. Your characters should feel over the top. We've been talking about villains. Your heroes also should feel over the top, and that very much is in the spirit of a lot of RPGs people play. Where there's RPGs that we've played, I'm sure, where all the characters are very realistic. You mentioned our Beyond the Supernatural game that we once played, and to make the horror commitment that we've talked about in the past, we really had to kind of underpower our characters in that game and be really vulnerable. Not true of a pulp game. In a pulp game, your characters are capable of jumping into a group of mooks and beating them all up and then moving on to the next thing and swinging from the chandeliers and doing all the crazy stuff that you want your heroes to do.
The funny thing is they only seem vulnerable in between scenes. Like, Indiana Jones is, he's got he hurts, he's sore. Yeah. But that never affects him when it counts.
Right. When the next fist fight comes on, the adrenaline starts up and.
Yeah. So as you can see, readers, Pulp has a lot of things. It's a lot of, it encompasses a lot of stuff, but the main thing is like high adventure. That's what I'm getting at you.
That's right.
So like if a player said, Ben, you're in a Pulp game.
Yeah.
There's another plane chasing us. I need to get up on top of the roof of this plane and set up my Gatling gun so I could shoot at it. As a GM, what would you say?
Of course you can do that. Yeah, that's a great part. So here's the thing. What's fun about this is like, unlike a very realistic game where you'd say, I'm sorry, you would be immediately swept off of the wing because there's a lot of air resistance, and you'd start telling some story that would absolutely be true in real life. This is a pulp game. So you're going to get up there. We're going to say, yeah, you brace your feet in the struts of the wing and you get your Gatling gun up and set up. And then,
and your fedora stays in your head the whole time.
It does. It does. So yeah, no, look, it's big, bold colors. It's big, not subtle moves. It's high adventure. It's clear good guys and bad guys. That's the feel that you want. And what's kind of fun about this, if you kind of go back, Pulp is the thing that just precedes the real comic book era that starts in the 40s and gives us our first generation of superheroes.
Yeah, I mean, Batman kind of is.
He's got
a foot in both worlds, right?
He does. Yeah. Batman is a pulp hero. He was very much a part of the same generation of characters as the Shadow, for example.
Mhm.
And when you look at a character like Doc Savage, Doc is good at everything. He's kind of like the way that we talk about Batman now. People kind of complain sometimes about Batman being, he can fight and he can outthink everybody and he's got all the gadgets and he can do all these different things. I mean, in a certain sense, that was the same thing that Doc Savage would do. Is he was just super trained on every possible thing. Ideal body, ideal mind, everything
Yeah,
else.
he had his group of, I think they called them like the Magnificent Seven or something like that.
Yeah.
And they were just there to like say, you're awesome.
They were there when you needed an extra pair of hands, but how often did that really happen?
Yeah.
Not often, friends.
Not often. So like these are kind of the characters that translate to the table though. Like, do they translate well? Like what of these pulp kind of characters, you can't have a Doc Savage in a game with 4 or 5 other players. So you got to tone some of those aspects down.
Yeah, if you're thinking about a pulp game, the best thing to do is to really focus on, as we've talked about recently, balancing your party and making sure that not one person can do everything, but that people go deep into those specialties. And you can still do that big, bold, I am the best mechanic in the world at this, or I'm the best martial arts fighter in the world, or the best detective in the world. And my heavens, what would happen if you got such amazing characters all in one party? What crime could stand against them and not be revealed by the light of justice? You can hear the moves here.
Yeah, there was that. Was it?
Are you thinking about the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen?
Yes.
That's Alan Moore. Yeah, that's
Alan Moore. Okay.
Yep.
So Alan Moore had that. And that was kind of his take on like a pulp assembly of these ridiculous characters all together.
Well, and that's a great reason why I don't think pulp and period stories are the same thing, because those characters are all Victorian era. That's late 19th century British.
But they were kind of brought in a very pulp movie.
No, that's exactly my point, is they are prime pulp, right? It's just in the Victorian era, they were in penny dreadfuls. But penny dreadfuls were basically the Victorian equivalent of the pulp magazines that we saw later in the 30s and through about the 50s and 60s, I want to say. So you have the same kind of storytelling going on at different periods of time. And you can find that even today. So just the same way that we're saying pulp is now, you could also say, well, it's also prior to the 30s.
So when you've got your pulp characters, particularly we'll use that film that we're just mentioning, these characters are very unique and they have their very set of skills. You know what I mean?
Right.
They still need to like lean on each other to fulfill this story, which is the campaign, which is what we're talking about. So like, let's talk about the game. Really, what kind of systems would you recommend? I wouldn't say all game systems are built for this type of thing.
I think you're right. Remember that point about there being high action in a lot of it. One of the things you want to do is you want to play a game that won't get bogged down in pace. There's a lot of games that can do that. You also want the game to feel, I think, very impactful, very tactile, very, in some ways, I want to say also a little bit grounded, so that when there is a big impact because a player did something amazing, or when they manage to actually like hit that guy super hard, like you kind of feel that too. I realize that might sound a little contradictory, but the pace is the main thing. And I think when you think about systems that can do that, currently I'm gearing up for a campaign with a system called Broken Compass, which I'm really looking forward to. And that's very rules light. The mechanics in that one, just to give you a sense of this, are almost like Yahtzee. You're rolling dice, not to get to a sum of a number, but just to see how many of your dice in your pool matched each other, like you would get 2 or 3 of a kind.
I could see that be pretty exciting once you get a couple matches.
Yeah. Well, and also they've got a mechanic for like, if you didn't get it, you can reroll, but you also could fail harder too. So the escalating risk as you get through is really fascinating.
It feels like failure is part of the genre. Who was it that said, like in Star Wars, every failure is just a success in a different way? Bob might have mentioned something like that. We were talking with him, and it's so true. Like, it's that thing where you miss with your blaster, but you hit the door and the door shuts and hits the person.
Right. There's a lot of games out there that now will give you a kind of dice mechanic that lets you succeed with complications or fail, but with some advantages. And I think that's very much in the spirit of pulp storytelling, Yes, Indiana Jones does manage to make the leap onto the truck, or maybe he makes the leap into the truck, but then he loses his gun along the way as it gets jostled free of its holster.
Yeah. And that just only heightens the adventure, at that point.
Yeah.
So those complications in a sense become either another thing for him to overcome, because it's the hero has to overcome these things, right?
Yeah, I think for people that aren't familiar with this or may wonder, like, how do these stories kind of come together? One of the best things that you could do for a pulp story is read the Lester Dent formula. The Lester Dent formula is Lester Dent was the guy who wrote all the shadow stories in
Okay.
the pulps. And so he had a story. He could say, I've got this formula that I use every time I'm writing a story like this. It will give you short stories of about 6,000 words. And he'd say, all right, in the first 1,500 words, here's what you're going to do. You're going to get the hero into a heap of trouble. Get him right in there in the first line of the story. Don't waste time. Jump into the action. Bring in some allies. Give him a plot twist, right? Okay, in the next 1,500 words of the story. And he would kind of go through and say, these are the kinds of things you want to have happen. And it's all about that escalating conflict. It's all about ramping the action up. It's all about new locations, new plot twists.
And folks, if you're thinking about this, some of these stories were written back in the 1930s, 1920s even, and they were in these magazines, and they didn't have a lot of pages. Like they weren't,
right.
They had to fill them quick, so they didn't have time for anything other than just getting right into it.
Yeah, they had to do it immediately because their editor was going to say, "This is losing my attention."
These kids are going to be picking up these books, and they don't want to be bogged down with a long, drawn out intro. No, they right out the gate. The shadow's going to be punching somebody.
Yeah. And that's the thing is it's immediately engaging. We've talked about engaging your players and making sure that they are aware of the stakes of the story and so on. A good pulp writer in the very first scene is going to probably try to find some way to threaten your life of your PC or threaten the lives of your PC's projects and fortunes, threaten the PC's city, and so on.
So the system you're kind of thinking of, just kind of going back to that system, it sounds like it needs to be kind of dynamic. Like it needs to have some energy to it.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And definitely a skill system. You want to have a decent skill system.
The skills have to be broad enough that you can have all those different specialties that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that you have to have an especially crunchy system. Like, for example, Fate has a really great pulp supplement called Spirit of the Century, which I highly encourage people to read and check out.
Yeah.
And in that system, you can create the description of what your character is good at just from language. It's, my character is an archaeologist or my character is a detective. The idea is you don't necessarily have to have like a pre-written skill system that's got 50 skills in it or something like that.
Sounds like a little bit more of an aesthetic. And it sounds like you can apply it to other games.
Yeah.
Conan the Barbarian
That is a pulp fantasy.
If you want to run a D&D game in the pulp genre, what kind of things would you emphasize? Let's say you're going to, Ben, I want you to run me a pulp D&D game. What are the things that you would kind of like focus on?
The funny thing is, I think a lot of the stuff you need is already there. I think usually what I would do, though, is I'd pick up the pace a bit. I would make the villains as kind of crazy and interesting as I could. I would make sure that there were quick ways for us to get from place to place so that we could have a really interesting locations. You and I, as we've been playing Path of Exile recently online, one of the things we've been commenting on is how creative some of those maps are. If
we're playing a role-playing game, those environments would be so exciting to just explore and fight in.
So I think that's what I would do with D&D is just find ways to kind of pick up the pace, put people in exotic kinds of situations, locations, enemies.
Crank up those villains, man. Crank them up. Like they need to be WWF characters.
The heroes are already kind of pulpy, right? They are more powerful than average commoners. It's not like they're going to run into some bandits on the road and feel like, oh, hey, there's more of them than there are of us. We'd better, do what they say. No, they're going to engage fists and swords and everything flying.
I think we got a pretty good overview of what pulp is. And like, we kind of have some ideas about how we can utilize pulp in our games. And honestly, I think a little bit of pulp in just about any game could enhance your game, even if you're not going to jump fully into the genre. I do think villains in particular are best when they're just turned up a little notch.
Maybe it's worth talking for a moment, though, about where pulp doesn't fit as well, or where you've got to do some work to kind of make it fit, or maybe where there's some friction. I have a kind of a gripe that my friends know about when it comes to like Pulp Cthulhu.
Okay.
So think about what the Lovecraft mythos is, right? It's a situation where you're going up against these monstrous, unworldly things that are going to defeat human beings ultimately. Like there's no chance that we've got any way to deal with this stuff. It's set in the same kind of time period, right? So I've actually found that a lot of the maps that I like to use for pulp I basically borrowed from the Call of Cthulhu game, which is kind of better supported than I think any one pulp system is. And there's certainly a place for pulp horror, right? So I think you can do that. But in general, think back to what we were saying a moment ago about how your heroes are super capable. Not in a Lovecraft game, you know what I mean? Not in Call of Cthulhu. They may try to amp them up, but then there's this kind of, for me, a kind of an intrinsic tension between, well, wait a minute, are these guys the guys that are going to kind of win and be over the top and all that kind of stuff? Well, in that case, how scary is the mythos that they're going to run into actually?
I mean, in some sense, it's pulp in one aspect, in that it's got some of the tropes, but it also seems to turn it on its head. The heroes they fail. They're not supposed to succeed in Cthulhu, right?
Yeah.
You're doomed.
Yeah, and that's the things. I think you can still square that circle. You can still play that game and have a great time doing it. Mm-hmm. Maybe you're going to beat up the cultists a bunch, and maybe you're going to win for today, but not forever. So there's things you can do, but I think there's a little bit of a tension in there.
I feel like in that type of game, the long-term prognosis should never be in doubt.
In a pulp game or in a Cthulhu game?
In a Cthulhu, Cthulhu/pulp game, like you could have that exciting adventure, but as the game goes on, that inevitable outcome is inevitable.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's kind of the tension that I feel in that pairing of those two. The other one I'll say too is anything where you're doing like a really science grounded thing, like a science fiction game, I don't think that's going to lend itself well to pulp, because the more into reality you are, the more you're going to kind of dull some of those bright colors. I
would say a good rule of thumb is to imagine the soundtrack you want for your game.
It's a great idea.
And if it's a Cthulhu game and that soundtrack is dark and morbid, that ain't pulp. Pulp is bright. It's colorful.
That's right.
It's bombastic. Dun, 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 dun. I mean, it's just exciting, you know.
That's right. And I think something that's different too is when you think about the difference between pulp and other stuff around it, it's also not noir. Noir is a different kind of a thing. In noir, these are those black and white detective movies and stories of the 40s, Raymond Chandler stuff, and it's Sam Spade and the Maltese Falcon, right? And in those cases, the good guys are never really that great. They're alcoholic often. They're people with failures. These guys are not your best guys, but they're the guys that happen to be there that day. You know, the morality of those stories is gray. Pulp, justice is clear. You know what I mean?
Sin City kind of merged those two into a nice balance, I would say, in that you had that noir, but it was definitely a pulp film. These ridiculous villains had the exciting fight scenes, exotic locations, but it did have that film noir kind of detective gloss to it. I think it can be done.
So here's what I'll say about that is I think you're right that Frank Miller did kind of merge those in interesting ways. I do think, though, that detective stories and G-Man stories are a part of the pulp era as well.
Okay.
And you can find gangster stories and detective stories and things like that. And for example, that's exactly what The Shadow is, right? The Shadow is a guy who's fighting crime and gangsters and those kinds of villains. So think about the difference between what you'd see in a Shadow story versus Sin City or versus a different kind of Jimmy Cagney movie, let's say, or even Dick Tracy versus those kind of things, right? In all those cases, you're looking at the difference between kind of a very brightly defined moral world. There's a lot of heroes and villains that are very clearly heroes and villains. In noir, by contrast, it's shades of gray. It's anti-heroes. It's people who don't necessarily have that kind of clear definition and are certainly not hyperbolic.
Well, all interesting stuff. It actually gets me excited to play a pulp game. Ben, when are you running it?
Well, I'll make it the next thing we do. That sounds like a really fun thing to do, and I'm always up for it.
I think next time we go to Gen Con, maybe we have a pulp adventure.
Yeah, I will say, Mark, I think you and I, when we played that one pulp game at Gen Con a couple of years back, we were not super satisfied with it. And sometimes when you don't get what you want, you just got to do it yourself.
All right, welcome to the Tune Up segment. We got a question from one of our listeners.
I like this one.
They say, I've mapped my land. I've thought through its history. I've named its gods, formed its mythologies. How do I figure out what holidays to add to the annual calendar to give my players something to celebrate or navigate as they make their way through the world? That is a good question.
It's great, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have. I didn't realize, but we do have quite a few little holidays that we've added into our realm.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that just as this question comes across my eyes here.
You want to think of a couple things. One is you've got the history. That's your first go-to. Start looking at the events in that history.
Yeah.
What kinds of things would people celebrate? Was there the liberation of a people, or the day they first founded a city, or the day that the dark powers finally were put back in their box? Whatever kinds of things there might be, that's a great place to start.
I could think of a couple more. I mean, history is one, but I also think religious is one. So if you have your different religions, they should all have. I think every one of your religions in the thing should have some sort of significant day, or days, or weeks, or month.
I mean, a holiday literally is a holy day, right?
Yep. And then also, you got historical events, things that have happened in history.
Yeah.
And then regional. Regional could be. I think of like when I grew up in Spokane, Washington, we had the Cherry Pickers Trot.
What is the Cherry Pickers Trot?
Man, come on, man. You lived up there.
I did.
The Cherry Pickers Trot, they celebrated the cherry picking season. And so they would go up, and we'd all be up at the Green Bluff, and they would have contests to see who could spit the cherry seed the furthest, and all these types of things. They had a race to go with it. But that's a regional holiday.
You know what's cool about that too, right? Is that's a regional example of a holiday that a lot of different regions celebrate. So you could even find ways to vary by local culture or setting the kind of holidays that you have in that case around like a harvest festival.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one of our games, I had a holiday that came up every few years, and it was they celebrate the Everflame games, which was a celebration of heroes of the past, and people would gather to do contests. And that was a way to kick off a story. Holidays can be brought in that kind of fashion to either kick off a story, or maybe have a place where people gather and things can happen at those events.
So think about culture, think about history, think about the influence of regions and cultures on what are conventional cycles. You know, the other thing you can do too is you can use the absence of holidays. So I work with people internationally on different countries in the globe. And if you come from, say, a Catholic country, you probably have a lot more holidays because they had a lot more feast days in their historical calendar. So there's more holidays in some of those calendars than there were in, say, Protestant countries.
Yeah, I can also just imagine a deity who might worship cats. Right. Might have an excessive amount of holidays that involve sleeping in. And
yeah, I like that, right? Like find the thing that reflects the particulars of that thing. If it's a historical event based on, you know, like our 4th of July, right? That's in a certain sense, it celebrates the winning of a war. And so we pop off fireworks. But Thanksgiving's an eating holiday, you know.
And also just for like, imagine a science fiction game. What a great way to punctuate a historical event that might have some importance to the campaign.
Yeah.
I think about like, you know, I think Star Trek had like the first meeting where the Klingons and or not Klingons.
Yeah, they don't celebrate the Klingons' first meeting.
No. The Vulcans.
That's right. Yeah.
The people with the pointy ears.
Right. The logical guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
They had that first meeting day. I can't remember what they called it, but that was a thing. But what's nice about that in the context of a game is a holiday might punctuate a story element that you want to kind of have them focus on. And it's a good backdrop. If that's going to be something pertinent to your later story and they've celebrated that holiday, they're going to remember that. And it's a good way to kind of like squeeze that little bit of backstory in.
Well, and also think about the opportunity that a holiday is for a villain to enact a plot. It's been 10 years since the armistice, but this villain wasn't satisfied with the peace that broke out. And so they're going to reignite the war on the 10th anniversary of, like, that's such a great opportunity for villains to do big, flashy things.
That's a good point. So to our reader, our listener who sent in that question, I hope those give you some good ideas and where you can kind of start and how you can flesh out your world, make it feel real, make it feel exciting and bright, or dark and dangerous.
Well, Mark, I think that's all we've got to say about holidays. I think it's time to go celebrate the weekend. And friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode about Pulp. Stay tuned. We have more action around the corner next week at this time.
For now, I'm just going to play some Path of Exile too. I'm out of here.
That's right. All right, you guys. We'll catch you soon. Until we do, keep those dice rolling.
Tune up, level up your fun. Tune up, your quest has now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done. Tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up. Tune up, level up your fun. Tune up, your quest has now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done. Tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up. Tune up, tune up, level up your fun. Tune up, your quest has now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done. Tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up. Tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up, tune up, level up your fun. Tune up, your quest has now begun. Tune up, we'll show you how it's done. Tune up,